So we have a canvas panel here that I've already prepared just to save some time. Now the canvas panel was done in oils, and with the walnut alkyd medium that I added to it, okay, it was quick to dry and it's ready to be painted on right now. With this though, the technique that I'm going to show you in this workshop can be very easily done with acrylics as well. The only difference with oils, you're having to wipe your brush every time you load your brush. Okay. Acrylics, you just have to work a little bit faster and make sure you keep your brush damp so the acrylics don't dry in there. Okay. So with the panel that we have here already, okay, and this was just done basically with blues and whites, nothing fancy, a little bit of crimson at the top. So there's nothing fancy about this panel. When you're working on a study, okay, so we're going to be working on a mountain study, try to work on something you've already painted just so it has a bit more life. If you're doing a mountain just on an unpainted surface, you may not be able to get the full appreciation of color if you're just working on a white canvas. So I'm going to bring up the colors here. So what I have here is I'm using the Georgian oils, and what I have here is the titanium white, French ultramarine, permanent mauve, crimson alizarin, cadmium red hue, cadmium orange hue, cadmium yellow hue, and burnt sienna. Okay, very basic colors. I didn't bother with the green because we're not putting any trees inset into the mountain, and the burnt umbers and Payne's gray that I usually work with, I didn't bother with those. Now, I'm not going to add this in because I want to be able to show you how I'm going to be picking up the colors. You want to be able to add in a little bit of alkyd medium. Okay, so to these little patties, and you can compare it to the size of my finger, okay, or even to the size of the palette knife, you would add to these probably about 2 drops of the alkyd medium and just mix that in really, really well. To the white, though, to this particular one, you could add probably about 4 drops to the alkyd medium. This is if you want to speed up the drying time. I'm not going to add that in because I want to be able to hold this up onto the camera so I can show you the mixing. And we use such very little paint. We're using very thin layers. This will be dry for, let's say, next week. So I'm not too worried about that. Okay. So with these colors, we're going to be able to work with the blues and purples, okay, to block in color, and then we're going to work with the whites, orange, and yellow, okay, for what I call it the highlight mix. Okay, the sienna, the burnt sienna, I use to tone down the brightness, and sometimes just to create a darker pocket of color, like let's say right in here, I might add a little bit of it's brown to kind of reduce the brightness, but I don't want it too purpley. Okay, if that's a color, purpley right in here. The one thing that you don't want is all your mountains being exactly the same. Okay, so what you don't want is this. You don't want your mountains to be like that. Okay, that's a big no-no. Okay, big no-no to do that, because it's a repetitive pattern. You don't want that. Okay? The other thing you don't want to do is this when doing your mountain. Okay, that's just too in your face. It's too close into the center, and then anytime you put something in the center, then your eyes are spent balancing everything out. Okay? So you don't use repetitive patterns. Never make your peak right in the very middle. That's not interesting. That doesn't create some good negative space. Negative space is the empty areas surrounding an object. Okay? This is all negative space. And even we've got some stuff happening in here, some stuff happening in here, and some stuff happening in here. So all the space surrounding an object. So when creating your shape of your mountains, you want to make them kind of interesting. So what I did with this is I started off, and I'm going to outline it, I started off doing this. That's what I started off with. And I thought, that's kind of boring. So then what I did is I added another little one back here. I thought, well, I want something more in the peak, in the middle, so I added this one here, kind of popped in a little one here, and a little one in here. Okay, so now what we have this. But as well, when creating the shapes for your mountains, where you create your lines, make sure I have that right, also makes a big difference. There's a little one right here. Okay, so we have a lot of different, everything's not flowing the exact same way. Now, when doing this, I usually like to think of when creating my sketch, and usually I'll do this on paper first, is that come up with some kind of interesting things happening. Where in this one here was the same thing, kind of, started off with a general shape and added a few peaks. So to do that, right in here, that's all we're going to do. We're just going to add in just a little bit of shape just to get started. So we're going to assume, okay, that right here is our water line. Okay, so our horizon line. So we're going to be putting our mountain right up here. Could actually put even the mountain lower down here than have a lot of sky showing. But in here, so what I'd like to do is say, okay, well, I'm not going to put my mountain right here. I don't want to put it right in the center. Okay, I'll start off here for the shape, and I'm going to do this very light because this is an oil panel. I can't clean it as easily as the acrylic panel. And I'll start something like that. Okay. Oh, let's see. I've got a little one in the background, so let's say I want to create something a little bit higher. Now I'm only creating one set of mountains right now, so I can come here. Okay, quite the shape. There isn't anything repetitive in this. It's all different. If I look at something repetitive, I can see a little bump here and a little smidgen here, so I can very easily just change that to something like that. You don't want to see any repetitive lines, okay, because then your eye starts to go ahead of itself and you start to see things happening. Okay, so you want to keep everything very, very bouncy. So now what we have is our eye is going to go here, up, down, all the way up here and here and here and here. Your eye is going to move around. Okay. Your mountain is not necessarily going to end up in this shape, because as we paint, we're going to see things progressing. If we start adding our brush strokes, we're going to start seeing other rock formations taking place. So although I've just sketched in one mountain, by the time this is finished, we could have one little mountain here. We could create this piece here as a foreground mountain, or we can create these as foreground mountains just by how you highlight it. Okay? As well, when I start painting it, my mountains may not have this type of shape. I may just decide to kind of square this off a little bit. I don't know at this point. All you want to do is create the general shape of the mountain for this study. If you are creating it as an actual painting, then you have to kind of work the design around the other elements. And as the studies progress, we will start changing shapes of the mountains for our compositions. Okay, so for this here, we have the general shape down pat. Okay, I'm going to show you how to block in your mountain using a palette knife and using a brush. The difference between working with a palette knife and a palette knife, the paint goes on very, very thickly, and then you scrape everything off. Personally, myself, I don't like working with a palette knife for mountains. Okay, I prefer using a brush because I can get a much softer blending, especially if the mountains are way farther into the distance. But I'm going to show you how to mix that up anyways.